Well, thank you everyone for being here, and it's a pleasure to be at NYUAD. Finally, I waited a while to get here, and I'm happy to be here. And the food smells great, by the way, so enjoy it. All right, so I am going to try to stick to time. I am known to sort of ramble on. So please feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. It is a topic that is in progress, and in fact, my talk today draws from one of the chapters of the current book project that Tina mentioned, Demarcating Modernism in Iraqi Art, the dialectics of the decorative period 1951 and 1979. In this book, I look into coining local methodologies to enable a better investigation of modern art in Iraq. I raise methodological questions about the writing of art history in Iraq by contextualizing objects and practices through a wider lens in relation to modernism and historical evolution. As such, I intentionally revisit and update some of the theories about modern art and aesthetics in the Arab world that I have advanced in my previous book, Modern Arab Art, published in 2007 by the University of Florida Press. The current research is a study of the Iraqi modernist avant-garde in the mid-20th century. Specifically, the study is devoted to mapping out, analyzing, and contextualizing the discursive energies of modern artists and intellectuals in Iraq who were instrumental in negotiating and constructing the modern language of art in the period between 1951 and 1979, a period that represented a time of intense development and shifts in Iraq that witnessed the establishment of official Iraqi official art institutions and the emergence of a public art consciousness. In post-colonial Iraq, the development of a national art was in the hands of artists, particularly or perhaps because of the lack of an official institutional structure. What those artists initiated set a radical change for the development of modern art in Iraq. More importantly, the period marks a prolific negotiation of the decorative as signifier of both continuity and modernity, to form what Iraqi artists perceived as a visual language representative of their modern nation and reflective of their participation in writing this new chapter of their history. The book thus unpacks the decorative and its articulation in modernism at large and maps out its role in forming modernism in Iraq through detailed studies of key artists of the period in consideration. It does so on 4 levels. Theoretically, it revisits our understanding of modernism as a global phenomenon, as well as what the avant-garde means in Iraqi context. Second, it articulates the concept of Istilham as foundational in forming the Iraqi modern art vocabulary through examples of works of art and its trajectory beyond the Baghdad Group for Modern Art who initiated it. Third, it unpacks the decorative as a mode of articulation with its emphasis on the surface and in the process will contextualize many of the familiar objects of Iraqi art. And finally, it will present artists whose work has not been explored much in an effort to contribute to Iraqi art historiography. To be honest, the premise of the book is very simple. What makes Iraqi art Iraqi? Iraqis would argue that their modern art represents them. The neighboring Arab countries would agree that Iraqi modern art movements have been successful in achieving a unique style that is distinctly Iraqi. But what is it that makes the visual production perceived as Iraqi and uniquely identifiable as such? While one recognizes the localness in the content of the 1930s and 40s, rural and cityscapes and traditional neighborhoods and so on, I would argue that the art movements that followed went beyond the content to derive a specific line and surface negotiation I call line-mediated aesthetic, where the pictorial and ornamental collapse and the surface articulation negotiates both form and content with symbolic, expressive, abstract, and narrative-driven qualities that would be the identity signature for Iraqi art. Moreover, this line-mediated aesthetics is a specific negotiation of the decorative by Iraqi artists that was able to mediate between their past, drawing on Islamic and Mesopotamian, and present, which is modern styles, to resolve their perceived crisis of representation that is the result of modernity. In its precarious and ambiguous relationship with modernism in Europe, the decorative has been equated with primitive and expressive in modern art, as was formulated at the turn of the 20th century. This was particularly poignant with regards to non-European points of reference. You think of African masks and Islamic ornamentation, for example, and the notion of the barbarian. While in certain ways the decorative indexed modernity in European art, it was equally and pejoratively used to signify ornamentation of the applied arts perceived as dead by European modernists. For the Iraqi avant-garde, distinguished in their social efficacy, the decorative was not an end in itself, but rather a methodology of mediating modernism and visual and stylistic lineage. If Islamic art is argued to have given Matisse a solution to his interest in the decorative, for the Iraqi artists, the decorative facilitated the connection between their past with their present through what became coined as the concept of Istilham. The decorative in Iraqi modern art would denote honesty in painting and the line as direct surface manipulation of the expressive and at times symbolic qualities. The work thus did not perceive any tension between the decorative and the pictorial. Again, by the decorative, I mean the line quality that expresses itself in a linearity of expression without necessarily abandoning the representational, although could do so if it wants. This line quality does not differentiate between media or material, and design is a vital part of the composition where beauty and the sublime merge. The decorative has also been used to emphasize the unimaginative qualities and rigidity of Islamic art based within European art history, based on its religious interdiction in relationship to images. Stylized with preference to drawing over painting from observation. Oh, I'm sorry, wait, hold on. Yeah, okay. Right sequence. Where the images are stylized form with preference to drawing over painting from observation. That is Islamic art. One thus can easily argue that it is a specific act of resistance for Iraqi artists to transform the Islamic artist mastery of drawing and the arabesque, what has been described by many Orientalists as a rigid and lifeless ornament, into a dynamic image of the modern age. Moreover, Istilham enabled the Iraqi artists' more meaningful transition to add a negotiation of abstraction. Abstraction, which has resurfaced lately as a specific interest for exhibition and forums, and on which I'm participating in a panel this afternoon in Dubai, at Art Dubai, has established paradigms for understanding artistic development as intersected with a new set of Cold War era tensions that art historian Terry Smith has summed up so well as, I quote, abstraction versus figuration, which is the title of the talk, the panel this evening, nationalism versus international styles, preferees versus centers, artistic autonomy versus social obligation, dependence versus non-alignment, democracy versus socialism, end of quote. While not denying international politics intersections in Iraq as well, I situate abstraction in Iraq away from the Cold War politics and understand it via Istilham. As a result of inward tensions of self-expression, but not without dissolving some of the dualities that Smith listed. So what is Istilham? Artist Shakir Hassan al-Said once argued that the history of modern art in Iraq can be summarized as an obsession with Istilham. I totally agree with him. Istilham was the catalyst for individuality through a shared heritage. It became the distinctive tactic with variant interpretations in the history of Iraqi modern art. Istilham and the decorative, as negotiated through the line-mediated aesthetics, I argue shaped Iraqi modernism of the mid-20th century and was further transformed in the 1980s in light of socio-political changes of the time. Now, I am not going to take much time to actually talk about the actual works that we're seeing. However, if you have any questions about them, I'm happy to go back to them later. But, what I'm trying to show you here is that notion of Istilham as mediated among the various sort of, histories of Iraq. So clearly this is a votive Sumerian husband and wife, let's say, or, two figures. And this is a Jewad Selim, which I will talk about as an artist more later, sort of, drawing on that, or rather, mustalham from, and we'll talk about Istilham in a second more. The verb, we'll talk about it right now. The verb istilham is derived from the word ilham, inspiration, instinct, which is derived from the root lehm, to inspire, to pray. So notwithstanding the divine intervention the meaning carries, for Iraqi modernists, it was more of a conscious, process-oriented, performative act embroiled with agency. Those who know me well know that, for example, I am not a fan of the word inspiration because I feel that inspiration just sort of denies agency of the artist. And it is used specifically when speaking of Arab artists, for example, within this context. For some reason, Picasso was not inspired by African masks, but rather elevated them to art. But then Jawad Selim would be inspired by Picasso, for example. Istilham is a concept that advocates mediation between two things. It draws from one that already existed to inform one that is in the process of becoming, as it projects to the future. It thus equally embodies acts of deconstruction and unpacking in order to perform pointed construction that would necessarily carry social as well as personal significance. Formed by Jawad Selim and his then student, Shakir Hassan al-Said, in the opening of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, inaugural exhibition in 1951, which is also the year the group was formed, al-Said read their manifesto aloud and Selim delivered his impromptu speech, The Renewal of Art, describing the challenges of engaging an audience for whom modern art was wholly unfamiliar. The manifesto emphasized and promoted the notion of Istilham al-Turath, which issued an action of renegotiating heritage Turath to develop a progressive artistic vision, which was historiocultural and modern and capable of expressing what they termed as their contemporary characteristics. It invoked the two threads that were perceived as necessary for Iraqi artists to negotiate modernism: an imagined historical continuity that draws on various elements from Iraq's history, and an engagement with the international art development with an understanding of what modern art groups were doing. Thus, Istilham is positioned here between the past and the present to realize a new contemporary aesthetics. It was a call for action as well by the Baghdad Group for Modern Art. But first, I regress with a word about modernism. I would like to propose that modernism primarily entails a global crisis of representation. With the circumstances of that crisis, the specific forms it takes, and the artistic solution devised to respond to it, varying from one part of the world to another. So I don't speak of multiple modernities, I don't speak of other modernities, but I speak of one modernism that is very much affected by its locale. While not the first or last crisis of its kind, this one is directly caused by modernity and addresses representation as the means of depicting or portraying a subject with its connection to reality and originality as specifically distinct from pre-modern presentation. Modern art would then be understood within a broad non-linear and non-chronological narrative of intersections and overlaps that are dialectical and discursive, that can encompass global influences as well as account for the continuity of other artistic traditions and their ruptures. The crisis for modern Iraqi artists was rooted in the inability of the traditional modes of representation inherited from the Islamic period to depict their contemporary reality. In other words, a convergence of historical conditions both inside and outside of art, along with the destabilization of belief in the existing forms of expression in relation to the wider changes within society, affected art's capacity to depict the world. It is within this frame of modernism that I would like to look at the Baghdad Group for Modern Art's notion of Istilham al-Turab, and why equally Istilham here is negotiated as a national project. Selim and the rest of the group's main delineation of Istilham, as stated in their manifesto, is seen in their relationship with Maqamat al-Hariri, Hariri assemblies, that visually represented the events, stories, and anecdotes of al-Hariri's daily life encounters in Baghdad and Basra in the 13th century. The Maqamat is the only manuscript from the Baghdad School of Painting, so-called Baghdad School of Painting, that survived burning of Baghdad by the Mongols during the 13th century. While the text of the Maqamat has been celebrated for its dexterity, the accompanying images are extremely engaging. Most celebrated illustrated copy of the manuscript, renowned for the conceptual sophistication, scale, and quality of its images, was calligraphed and painted by Yahya al-Wasiti in Iraq, probably in Baghdad, in 1237 CE. Characteristic of the Baghdad School of Painting included the dialectic merger between text and image. Al-Wasiti's work came to the attention of the group in 1941 after its reproduction in a French journal. Al-Wasiti and the images thus served as a main facilitator for the members of the group in forming their theories and aesthetics. And it's really interesting to note that these 4 images that were published in the French journal were sort of the only access they had to Maqamat al-Hariri, not until maybe 20 years ago that Iraqi artists were able to actually see the full manuscript that is in the National Library in Paris. Nevertheless, Sheikh Hassan Said published his analysis of the few images of the Maqamat in a booklet titled The Artistic and Social Characteristics of Al-Wasiti's Drawing in 1964. The title pretty much speaks of how Al-Said saw the work of Al-Wasiti and Al-Wasiti himself as an artist whose work addressed social, racial, and class issues, as well as develops a specific aesthetics for negotiating them. This was specifically important for Shakir Hassan al-Said, who saw, for example, representational art as very bourgeois and abstraction a move away from it. So he saw artistic style within class and race views. He wrote, I quote, "It is not an illusion that an Iraqi painter arises from the first half of the 7th century after Hijrah with the same skills as a modern painter," end of quote. He located Al-Wasiti's roots in Mesopotamian traditions, further explaining that, again I quote, "as part of the accomplishments of the ancient civilizations in Iraq, that the Mesopotamian artist chose to develop a unique creative genius, which is undoubtedly Al-Wasiti's heritage," end of quote. And of course, by extension, Shakir Hassan al-Said and his generation of Iraqi artists' heritage as well. Much has been written and said about the tensions in the duality of modernism and tradition in Iraqi and Arab art in general. An excellent example to help us understand how Istilham help resolve this tension is in this juxtaposition of the modern and the traditional is here in one of Selim's iconic works from the series Baghdadiyat that was published in 1956. And I want to actually show you, which is a very interesting sort of another notion of Istilham, that this work that is at the collection of Mathaf, Arab Museum of Art in Doha, was reframed in the 1980s by Iraqi artist Dia al-Azawi, seeking, or rather, for those of you who understand the conjugation of Arabic, mustalham from Jawad Selim's work himself. So the frame that you see over there is not original, but was added with Selim sort of, in mind, which I mean, it's sort of a continuous cycle of Istilham. Clearly, from their name, the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, to naming his series, Selim's series, Baghdadiyat, Baghdad is central in the representation and references both the modern city of Baghdad and the Abbasid so-called school of art that I just mentioned. Yet, of course, Selim's representations of the city of Baghdad of the 1950s is a far cry from reality. The 1950s Baghdad was a changing city in the process of modernizing, but also a city of turbulence, demonstration, bombing, and where oppression and shortages were felt by the people. The other works that I showed you earlier, music, dancing in the street, those were also part of Baghdadiyat, by the way. In his discussion on modernism and art styles, artist Nouri Rawi argued that Iraqi artists of the 1950s and 60s, within their culture of anxiety, focused on society and people in their effort to close the gap between society and artists. Selim's series of Baghdadiyat are of a city that neither changes nor existed. An ideal romanticized and stylized imagination that invokes traces, signs, and symbols of cultural significance. However, the Iraqi critic and writer Suhail Nader sees the series as, I quote, a small ethnographic museum of objects and stories, end of quote, that of course relate to Baghdad. They thus represent a specific case of Istilham in their content as well, where Turath is the internal force and Istilham is the mechanism. These are images of modern Baghdad, clearly, as you can see, of the 1950s. The 1950s is a very interesting decade in Iraq and has become even more important to Iraqis after 2003. It is seen as the golden age. It is seen as Jawad Selim saw it, things that were disappearing but are very important and of significance. Again, memory is always faulty, and clearly for most Iraqi artists, for most Iraqis today who yearn for the monarchy, forget why the revolution happened. So. But what is interesting about the 1950s is that there were these sort of competing visions. So there was this cross-regional, pan-Arab nationalism and Iraqi nationalism sort of, playing in the dynamics, and the results ended being sort of a specific Iraqi nationalist vision that started with Jawad Selim and his artists, but the 1960s artists specifically carried further, which also is inclusive of the Arab as well. Arab nationalism. In this painting, back to Baghdadiyat, in this painting, Selim gives us a composite image of a popular, albeit generic in its non-specificity and abstraction Baghdad neighborhood. The seemingly unfinished sketch of a painting houses a myriad of vignettes that are as sequestered as they flow into each other. While they all exist in the space of the canvas, Selim creates pockets of activities that seem to be organized into two registers. You see the top and the bottom, which is something that, again, can reference Mesopotamian artifacts. On the lower register, from right to left, we see a woman carrying a basket on her head, another woman perhaps washing clothes in the river with two girls playing next to her, then two dogs, beautiful dogs, in confrontation with each other, a man on a bicycle with two children, and on the bottom left, a child asking his mother to get him what looks like a popsicle from the street vendor. On the upper register, from the right, we see two women speaking to each other over the fence, a sort of typical Baghdad neighborhood thing happening. Next, there are two musicians and children dancing, possibly a clip that references Selim's Music in the Street painting that we saw earlier. A woman looking out of an arched window, another woman and two men seated on a table, while a man on the far left cooking masgoof fish, traditional masgoof fish that now actually you can get in Dubai as well, which is a Sumerian recipe and technique of cooking the fish. The vignettes are all located outdoors. with big palm tree references in the far horizon and a full moon. Architecture is only seen on the upper left, where we see two houses facing each other. The one on the right has a window that evokes traditional architecture with the arched window, a form of a simplified shanashil, I guess, and decorative roof over the portico. On the left, there is a modern structure. Selim's people who inhabit this painting are all in traditional attire, except for the three seated individuals waiting for their ancient traditional mesbuk meal. They are positioned in the space between the two houses and demarcated by a horizontal swath of gray color as their ground. Within its formal structure, as a work of art, Selim creates an explicit rhythm connected through his undulating line and distribution of form and color. He creates a quietly active scene of happening, while he equally resolves issues of representation through what has been dubbed as his hilaliyat, sort of the crescent-shaped forms. Hilaliyat aesthetics. The upper left corner of the painting, however, interrupts that flow of the rhythm perceived through the rest of the painting. The frontality of the woman in modern attire, seated with the two men, but emphasized through the use of color nods to Edward Manet's 1832-1883 Le Déjeuner sur l'heure. That was, Manet's work was produced in 1862, I'm sorry. Manet lived from 1832 to 1883, but this work was, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe was exhibited in 1862 as an act of defiance. What does it mean to place the modern woman in the painting to be, and there's a history of that painting for those of you who are not in art history, about a naked woman with dressed men, and that was sort of revolutionary in the context of Paris at the time. So what does it mean to place a modern woman in the painting to be facing her viewers, while all the others who inhabit the painting are busy engaged with activities of sorts? Particularly, the other woman looking out of the window is placed behind bars that evokes a cage, demarcated by the other horizontal band of olive green color. Her line of vision seems to follow the woman in modern clothing. It is clear that Selim uses these horizontal swaths for emphasis and visual direction. Maqamat al-Hariri, and I'm ending Selim's work by showing you his last work, the last work he worked on, and in fact died before it was finished, and still stands in Baghdad in Tahrir Square, Nasb al-Hurriya, the monument of freedom, I guess translates. That had been, and you're seeing actually a 70s image on your left, and then a more recent image during the revolution in Baghdad, where the Nasb al-Hurriya and its symbolism, it was commissioned to commemorate the 1958 revolution, and in it, Jawad Selim was a sculptor more than he was a painter. So while he painted in the 50s, he always had that tension between painting and sculpture, and goes back to sculpture. And in this work, that sort of, was an important development, because it was the first public monument in Baghdad, in Iraq, to be erected by an Iraqi artist. So, there were two others before that were General Mode and King Faisal, and they were by European sculptors. So this was specifically important. And also what made it stand till today is that it did not include an image of Abdul Karim Qasim, for example, who is the one who commissioned it, following the success of the revolution and the end of the Iraqi monarchy. So in this work actually is in sort of three registers. The middle, you can read it either right to left or middle out. The first section on the right is the before the revolution, the middle is the revolution, and the end, the other side is the after revolution. But it's about struggle, it's about humanities, it's about Baghdad. And the style is sort of, draws on Sumerian as well as his own sort of, Hilaliyat and work that he was developing, but also Cubism and Surrealism. And so in the context, it really mediates within this notion of Istilham between the various parts of development. Maqamat al-Hariri, I'm going to end with a contemporary artist, as a matter of fact, who has an exhibition in Dubai as we speak. Maqamat al-Hariri and al-Wasiti and the notion of Istilham remain part of Iraqi's unique visual heritage. Born in Baghdad in 1981, artist Haif Kahraman grew up in Iraq and Sweden and currently lives in LA, Los Angeles, in the US. Her work explores a compendium of current issues of general human concern, alienation, marginalization, loss, displacement, social destruction, gender empowerment, and oppression. And of course, the refugee and diasporic experiences, which is part of hers as well. Her interest in the body as object and subject is in particular, the concept of gender and female identity is manifest in all of her visual articulations. In various ways, her work presents diverse angles of a self-portrait woven through the formal qualities, intricate line and vibrant color. Her aesthetics and the seductive beauty of her images mask poignancy and fear while subtly mediating hope. Kahraman's relationship with Iraq is based on distance and is explored through memories and research. In her recent works, she engages with fragments of these memories in a yearning to bridge that distance and merge the past and the present into her realities. It is a process of reuniting her two selves, she argues. Significantly, as the temporal distance increases, she moves beyond the abstract to engage with specific sites, forms, and formats of meaning to Iraq. In Are We Not All Foreigners, or An Identity Test, How Iraqi Are You, a series of work that she produced in 2015, Kahraman, a contemporary American artist, further navigates her own diasporic experience and identity in reference to not only memory, but a historical continuation that, as we saw, was specifically the hallmark concern of Iraqi modern artists in the mid-20th century. She, as did members of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art, invoked the 13th century Maqamat al-Hariri as her site of engagement. She specifically inhabits and genders the space of her lineage, visual heritage, in an act of situating her own displacement, speaking more of destruction than continuity. Istilham and the decorative, thus, as negotiated through the line-mediated aesthetics, I argue shaped Iraqi modernism of the mid-20th century and was further transformed in the 1980s in light of socio-political changes of the time. It nevertheless equally has its place through the contemporary moment. Thank you. Thank you, sure. Happy to have questions or comments. What time is it?
Yeah, it's 1:10.
Okay, then we're good. Yes, so I was able to.
You did it in a moment.
Yeah.
So I'd like to open the floor to anyone who has any questions for Nada.
Or comments, or suggestions, or anything, especially for those of you who come from outside of the art world. I'm always curious to engage with possibilities. No questions?
No questions. Okay, then I will pop in with one or two. I'm really interested to ask you, why do you think there are particular aspects of Iraqi history that are drawn on by the artists? For example, Al-Wasiti's work, and maybe, let's say, not another person, and also in relation to that, to the decorative. Why are those aspects of the past drawn on by the artists rather than maybe another aspect?
So why certain episodes of history and not others? I mean, to start with, to be honest, I don't think they knew all the history. I don't think they know all the history. I don't think we know all the history yet. So there's that. And with colonialism came archaeology and so archaeological exploration. So they were rediscovering their past as everyone else was. I mean, We all know the story of Gertrude Bell and Museum of Antiquity at the time, and excavations, and all of the contemporary, the modern artists actually worked in the museum. So Jewad Selim worked in the museum, as well as Hafid Drubi and everyone else. Sata al-Husri, who was a Syrian educator and who was the head of antiquity, and he was the one actually responsible for even sending artists on scholarships, made a point of making sure that they come back and that they engage with the museum and work in the museum. So they were seeing excavations as they were happening, and whatever artifacts that were coming to the museum, and which increased with time, of course, And so the Sumerian and Assyrian, something that they were discovering. But the then finding of Maqamat al-Hariri, because of the Mongol sacking of the city of Baghdad and burning basically libraries, there wasn't anything much left, and particularly things that were produced in Baghdad. Some of Maqamat al-Hariri, because the Abbasid dynasty sort of moved to Cairo, were reproduced in Cairo and in Mosul. But they were rare, and this one by Yahya al-Wasiti was a very rare one and the only sort of one intact. And so they had no access to it. It was in France. And so, again, the colonial aspect of things. And so when they saw these 4 images, pretty much it was a moment of amazement for them that this is the solution. This is it. Here's our ancestor. He was doing what we want to be doing. And so that was their engagement with al-Wasiti, without necessarily thinking about engaging Islamic as much, because they actually argued against the Islamic age. And that's a sort of a colonial heritage as well, partly, because this was one of the things that were, the Hashemite monarchy, with sort of the Islamic references. And so they felt that they were forced into an Islamic past as opposed to modern being. That they couldn't be modern, but they could be sort of a continuation of an Islamic figure. So it's an ideological and political sort of choice of things to connect to Yahya al-Wasiti and think of him as a Mesopotamian artist as opposed to an Islamic artist, without denying, of course, the continuity of Islamic civilization, but without sort of highlighting it very much. Yeah, this is something we see happen in other parts of the Arab world as well. And that's something we grapple with now, because, for example, the reason why I say in this book, I revisit some of my theories in the book that I published in 2007, because since we have archival materials. Something like in Moritz Center here now, for example, having archival material is something I didn't have when I was doing most of my work. But now we have archival material, and we can look deeper, and we can hear the voice of the artist and understand perhaps that there is that continuity. The rupture existed, ideological rupture, but practical continuity also existed as well. So we're reevaluating these connections as we move forward in a sort of a better understanding. And of course, it seems people read books more than articles. And so, I see people still referencing my 2007 book. And so I'm like, okay, this needs to be re-articulated in a book. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Nada. It's always great to hear you speak. So I have a question about, because in the images, clearly, Jewad Selim was referencing the Sumerian men and women, especially with the eyes around faces, even sometimes like trying to take these lines. But then also the Wasiti images emerged, as you said. And how do you see that with these 2 references, between, 2 different times, adult or kind of, given and taken, and the artists were giving and taking these elements within one work, within a series of works or decades of work. What is how did these images also kind of shape a movement, or but just to understand how the relationship between the inspirations of the images that relate to the history of the region or the area.
So Istilham, that's the modem operandi here. And so it's actually sort of an unpacking and abstracting as a form of distancing between these forms that he saw, whether the Sumerian, the almond shapes, which he kind of then abstracts into hilaliyat. And I am not able to go back to the images, so I'm not sure.
Give me a second.
Oh, okay. And so let me go back to actually this one. Yeah. When it shows up. So he, by abstracting these forms into these, so I mean, like use that hilaliyat shapes, the crescent shapes, that becomes almost like a rhythm, a pattern, an arabesque, if you wish, right? From these forms that then creates the shapes that we don't necessarily see in maqamat. But what we see in maqamat is the two-dimensionality, the surface treatment. And so, in a way of which is, very much modern art as well, right? And so that's why I say, modernism needs to be reevaluated, because we seem, or at least it was given to us as a European development, but we all know now that it's not really a European development. And we can see, the notion of abstract and abstracting the figurative in the work of al-Wasiti. It's interesting that for someone like Jawad Selim, he doesn't move from the figurative. The figure remains, even when abstracted, remains very important aspect for him. But then Shakir Hassan al-Said, his co-founder, moves away totally into a non-thing, representation. But for the group, and all the group were experimenting with sort of these ideas of trying to figure out how to create this visual language from it, from working, from mediating and abstracting between these two periods, let's say, or to in this case, specific object. But remember, Shakir Hassan Said said he was this guy, and Wasiti is a Mesopotamian artist. So he carried the heritage of the Sumerian that they kind of continue.
I want to pick back up on this kind of comparison between the Wasiti and on the more contemporary examples. And when we're looking at this, there's such an emphasis on context and like space versus event in the Baghdadiyat. And I guess I'm wondering, like, what does it mean to read an image historically as it moves from a more spatial reading to one that's more based on event?
I mean, there are events in here as well. And these stories are based on actually a narrative, a story. And so they all refer to an event. While actually Jawad Selim's Baghdadiyat are more sort of open abstract, so they are, they carry events. I mean, if you see music in the street, that's an event. The one that I went through the details have various sort of events, almost like an anthology of events happening together. So you see, I mean, this is why Jawad doesn't move away from the human sort of interaction. And because also at the time, for him particularly, it was important to have people understand what they're talking about. So the event remained, or sort of a narrative of sorts, even if symbolic, remained important to him. Now, the process of how you go, I mean, it varies from one artist to another, of how you mediate between these two periods and two different aesthetics.
It's really interesting, the collapsing of time within them. This starts to be, I mean, with the kind of depiction of the popsicle, or as you have in the previous painting with the street. So this drawing on time in terms of the contemporary, or what was happening in the city, along with the historical reference, all gets collapsed.
Exactly.
That's really,
exactly. But that's also part of that distancing. That's also part of that mediating
and lack of perspective.
And lack of perspective, exactly.
You had a question.
Yeah, I have a question. This may be another topic, I don't know, but I'm just curious to know a little bit more about that era, the 50s, 60s. What was the exchanges? What were the exchanges in the region? Because you talk about the
regional exchanges.
Yes,
In
so,
the 1950s, very
how
little.
are they connecting between
Yeah.
Egyptians, Lebanese artists, Tunisian? Was there any? Is there anything specific going on at that time?
1960s, yes, because that actually the generation of the 1960s faulted the 1950s generation and the Baghdad Group for modern art for having a narrow vision that was very sort of Iraqi and local. And so they opened up, like, for example, the New Vision
For 10
group.
years, no.
So in the 1950s with the monarchy, there are a few things. So they did have an exhibition actually in Beirut, but that's the UN and UNESCO intervening. There are sort of, specific moments of interaction that are very official, right? I mean, they even had an exhibition go to Moscow in 1959, but it was a lot more sort of structured through institutions. In the 1960s, it was the artists themselves. Right? But that also then led in the 1970s to the creation of the Association of Arab Plastic Artists. And so they sought that connection. But it's a lot of it has to do with the shifts and changes that were happening politically. I mean, yes, there were a lot of demonstrations about the Baghdad Pact, for example, when it happened in the 1950s, the trio attack on Egypt. So there was that happening. But in the 1960s, 1967 happened. And so, there were a lot more sort of political reasons to unite. For example, you see the difference in the language of the manifesto of the Baghdad Group for Modern Art and the manifesto of the New Vision with the, artists, Zawi, Rafa, Nasri, and the group, which is a lot more.
Which year again?
1968.
That's the second.
Yes, yeah. So the 60s has a very different, it's also very individualistic. 1950s a lot more sort of group oriented. I mean, and Jawad Selim, one wonders, he died young. He died in 1961. He was 40 years old. He was still working. He had a heart attack. He had heart issues. One wonders what would have happened if Jawad Selim lived longer. Shakir Hassan Saeed lived longer. The Baghdad Group for Modern Art tried to survive after Jawad Selim, but didn't. But Shakir Hassan moved on to a lot more things and very influential in the education of many of the other Iraqi artists and generations that followed. So who knows? Right? That's something we'll never know.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shabut. Always a pleasure. I'll then take you towards the end of the 20th century, and so specifically after the war, during the war.
Sure.
Well, yeah, true. Let's take Desert Storm, for example, and specifically the sanctions, and particularly during Saddam's rule. As you know, art was heavily monitored and censored, but also at the same time, during the sanctions time, there was a near total ban on any cultural interaction, to the extent that no material, nearly absolutely nothing, arrived from overseas to Iraq. So do you see that kind of reinforcing this legacy of Istilham within Iraq? This is the first question. And the second question is, I know you're still pretty much involved in the Iraqi contemporary art scene. So how do you see this Istilham kind of continuing in this era as well?
So, to go back to the sanction period where even journals and magazines were not entering. So the only thing Iraqi artists had, and we're talking about the generation of the 80s and 90s, the only thing they really had was the Museum of Modern Art, the Saddam Center for the Arts, which had all these works and more, and including some other works by Arab artists and European artists. But one of the main things that actually happened, and this is where Shakir Hassan Saeed was extremely influential, is he was at one point the director. All the Iraqi artists were very involved in the museum. So they all held positions at one point or another. At Shakir Hassan Saeed, who was also a historian and theoretician, so he was writing and teaching at the same time, was also at the museum. So he was going in a very different direction. And so what ended up, the Istilham al-Jidar, Istilham al-Haf, so Istilham continued, right? But in a very different way. the wall, the traces of people, and Shakir Hassan goes into Sufism a lot, and then it becomes sort of more contemplation as opposed to creation. But what happens with his students, they actually almost reevaluate what the 1950s generation did, very critical about what they saw as more connection to Europe, for example, than their own heritage. And so there is a very sort of a tension, between these generations theoretically and philosophically. Now, what ends up happening is that we see the work, for example, of sort of talking to your second question, Haif Kahraman, who is outside of the country, researching Iraq, wanting to understand her Iraqiness. So she sort of stumbles on the same things that others did. Inside of Iraq, now, this last year when I was there, and it was the Al-Wasati Festival, which was, something that started in the 1970s, and of course, then stopped for a while. And so this was a celebration of starting it, and it's doubtful that it's going to happen this year, or when it happens again. But what I saw is that, well, after 2003, supposedly the world opened up, that they have access to internet, they have access to Jordan, which has been sort of was and continues for many of them main access outside of the country, but it's a very sort of limited vision. So and some of them may have had a visit or two to Dubai, for example, but they're very, very their vision or their access and their exposure is very restricted. Many of them are looking back at heritage, at Sumerian, in a very different way. So Istilham becomes something, different. But mostly, in fact, I am thinking that they are a very oppressed generation of artists, because the generation of this is being recorded. I'm going on record saying this. I do need to go to Baghdad. So, but the generation of the 80s who were inside of the country during the sanctions, cut off from the rest of the world. Then when they came out, they really did not know where they would fit. I vividly remember we were in London. I can't remember what year exactly, but maybe 2011 or 12. And Hana Malala and I were going to this exhibition because she just came out of the country. We were going to this exhibition by Khalil Rabah, Palestinian artist. And it was his United Palestine Airlines. And she was baffled continuously, didn't really understand, what is this? Why is this? Because she was thinking in a very different terms. And then when we left, she said, okay, I don't understand. I don't see where we fit. Those the before us, got the fame and recognition, and those who left the country are in a very different direction. Where do we fit? It took her a while to figure out where she fits and how to move forward. Mostly those inside who remained inside, all of a sudden found out within the last decade that they have power because they are teaching at the academy, they are at institutions. And so it was their time to sort of direct the scene and what's happening. And in doing so, though, they are still in various ways stuck in the 1980s and 90s, and sort of forcing their students in that direction as well. I heard the cries of the younger generation saying, we need help. We need to, see something different. And at the academy, the teaching, with the very, very limited resources they have, like actual material, but also theoretical, because doing this, for example, project grant, a Getty grant project on mapping art history of the Arab world, Iran and Turkey, and trying to see where is art history in Iraq, for example. I mean, it was in the notebook of one of the head of fine arts, who was like, yeah, I mean, here's what I teach, and there are 3 sections. That's the syllabus. And so, and there's no reading material. So Istilham continues because they, and also this generation does not have access to this. The museum has a fraction. When they did the Al-Wasati Festival last year, the sort of the pride of it was that they opened the Hassan Hall, and they had a group of works that were in good condition and were retrieved, and they were able to exhibit them, which was amazing. But for many other Iraqi younger Iraqi artists, they've only seen bad images in old publications of this, for example. So the museum doesn't exist anymore. I mean, in that there is a museum, but there is no sort of it does not have the 7,000 works it did before.
Hi, I'm sort of curious about the effect of the sieges on the artists in Iraq, because just out of personal experience, that artists my generation that I've met in Egypt or in Europe are very familiar with Egyptian art and art history sources and resources from the 60s and 70s and 80s, more actually than I would find Egyptians my generation. So my father is Hassan Selim, born 1928 and died 2008. And his writings, which were for a while, some of them actually out of print, I'd find people my generation in Iraq extremely familiar with everything that's been written in relation to art history throughout the region from these periods, whereas in other places where these books are out of print and so on have lost their value in a way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Iraq is known to read and have good book resources, right? I mean, I'm going next week in a couple of weeks, mostly so I can get resources, because you can get stuff within a street still. However, at the academy and at the Art Institute, which was sort of the jewel of teaching art in the region, is in a pathetic state at the moment, and there's nothing. I mean, the actual building is falling apart, and there are no resources. And they have a segregated boys in the morning and girls in the evening, for example, classes, which is also something that didn't exist. And at the arts, at the College of Fine Arts, in 2003, the library was burned, fully burned. I have photos of that. As a matter of fact, it was said that the Baathis burned it before leaving because it contained a lot of stolen books from Kuwait. So the library is gone. Artist Wafa Bilal, for example, tried to do a project to take books there, and that was a nightmare of logistics to do. So we're try to take books there. Now, there are some resources, but they're not accessible for everyone. So there are individuals who have their private libraries, and they have everything that was printed in Egypt or in Lebanon in the 60s and 70s, but they're not accessible for everyone. They're not available for everyone. That's the problem. So there is a generation that still has access to this. And then, from what I saw, your generation, the younger generation, is very selective access. It all depends on who and what access they have to.
I mean, most of the ones before 2003 makes sense for my generation.
Yes, yeah, true.